Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on our webinar this afternoon. I am pleased to introduce Sheldon Primus, who is the CEO of Sheldon Safety Consulting. He is a certified occupational safety specialist. He does training consulting for general industry, construction, water, and wastewater industries. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. If you're unable to hear, log in, or having any technical difficulties, please put that in the chat window. Throughout the webinar, there will be questions for you to answer. Just participate in just checkpoint activities, and you can put those answers in the chat box as well. You will have about 15-25 seconds to put the answer in, and you will receive bragging rights if you get the right answer. So at the end, we will address all questions that are submitted using the Q&A box underneath the chat window. And so at this point, I'll pass it over to Sheldon, and he'll go ahead and get started with the webinar.
Great. Thank you, Allison. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for giving me an hour of your time. I know it's really hard getting some time to break away, do a webinar, get some learning in, so I really appreciate that. We're going to start with our course objectives. So first, we're going to understand a bit about the health hazards of the respirable. I didn't write that in, but we're talking about respirable crystalline silica. And as a note, I'm going to say silica a lot instead of respirable crystalline silica. And I know that probably is because I don't want to say that each and every time I have to say silica. So let's just go ahead and think of it as silica, and you'll know what I mean by that. We'll recognize the materials that are contained in silica, inform about some key provisions in this new rule that's got everybody coming, and everybody's talking about it. I had a conference yesterday with a group of people that are very nervous about these, so we'll definitely go over some of the new rules. And this training is based on the rules, so we're going to be looking through both general industry and construction. And Maritime is actually combined with general industry, so when I do talk about general industry, Maritime is included as well. And we'll go through the standard as well as we'll also talk about some of the health hazards and what you need to do pretty much to protect your workers. It's broken into chapters, so chapter 1, we'll start with your old regulation. What we had before was really not protective. It was a lot of people who were exposed to high-risk levels of silica, and the government knew that, so they had to address it, and OSHA has decided that they're going to use the newer version of the permissive exposure limits. That's your PELs, and that is reduced quite from a lot from the last time, and that was 250 micrograms per cubic meter, and in general industry that equivalent formula was basically about 100, so you had a big difference between construction exposure and general industry exposure. So they OSHA decided that they're going to make that more of a even keel. Everyone's going to have the same type exposure limits as well as the action item limits. So that's what they're looking for, and that's the heart of this standard. So I gave you the definition already of permissive exposure limits. That's an OSHA standard. So anytime you see your PELs coming from OSHA. But there's two other entities that do time-weighted average, short-term exposure limits, ceiling limits. That's called NIOSH. NIOSH is your National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, and your AGCIH, that is the American Governmental Conference of Industrial Hygienists. So those two groups are giving you what you see as your short-term exposure limits. So over a 15-minute time period, this is how much your workers can be exposed to whatever the chemical is. In this case, we're talking about silica. Ceiling is your absolute level. You hit that ceiling limit, your workers have to get out. They need to find a good place without any exposure, or else you still are hitting that ceiling. So you don't want to get to that level. So the new levels is your 50 micrograms of silica, and that's over your time-weighted average of 8 hours. And your AGCIH says that that recommendation of 50 over the time-weighted average is going to be protective enough for your workers. And truly it is. And in many cases, you're doing some outdoor work that's going to have some silica exposure. So with that outdoor work, you've got some wind, you've got a few other things that will be naturally helping out your workers there. So with this new PEL, your permissive exposure limit, you do have an action item, and your action limit is 25 micrograms in a time-weighted average. So that action just means at that time period when you hit that concentration, you had to do something. It's time for you to institute some more controls. It's time for you to reevaluate how you're working and reduce that respirable crystalline silica standard, or not standard, but exposure. So the industries that are impacted here, you've got several. Construction, you'll see with the manufacturing sectors, all of those people that are exposed to these hazards here, they have to really take a good hard look at what their workers are starting to be exposed to on a continuous basis. But OSHA has made it where you could have a few different ways of testing out what your levels are. So right here I got an activity, and it's giving you the answers of false right there, so I don't have to have you type that in. But the action level, again, is at 25 micrograms, where the permissive exposure limit is 50. So that's a big difference for you. And once you get to that action item, that's really what you have to start making some big process or exposure changes, reduce that exposure. So let's talk a little bit about what is your respirable crystalline silica. It's a big one. Everyone wants to try to just think it's construction with cement, and yes, it is, but it's very easily all the different forms of your quartz that you're seeing there. Once that rock starts getting broken up, that is the part that is really going to affect you. So I'm sure some of you have opened up a new pair of sneakers and you see the little gel that says silica in it. Yes, that's silica, but that's not the type that you're going to be exposed to that is going to make a difference in your health unless you're eating it, and you don't want to do that either way, right? So you want to be able to protect your workers from the breathable, respirable part, and that's what we're dealing with. So that definition that you're getting from the ISO, the International Organization of Standardization, they're the ones that came up with a specific particulate size. And with that particulate size, that's what we're counting as respirable. So if you go to that ISO 7708, and the 1995 version is where we got that definition from. So I noticed our Q&A, someone did answer false. All right, you nailed it. Silicosis is one of the chief things that you're dealing with silica exposure. So silicosis, how it affects you is it's a pulmonary lung disease, and it just dries up your lungs, and it makes it so hard for the worker to breathe because it's literally killing lung tissue, and it's going through the level of your air sacs themselves. So that immune system that is getting just attacked, it makes it so hard for them to work. So if anyone were to take in any kind of toxin in your system, your macrophages, they notice it, and they start targeting them, and they try to engulf whatever that is, and in this case it's the silica, but they can't really dissolve it, so they just get built up with silica and those quartz way down, and then they embed themselves into the lungs. So as that macrophagia gets embedded into the lungs with the silica, then now the lungs themselves, one air sac at a time, becomes debilitated. And as it becomes debilitated, then that's the scarring in the lungs. So as the lungs get scarred, the worker now has a tough time breathing, and that's where you're going to get the coughing and the hacking and the bluish color to the air lobes and sometimes the extremities. So that's what's happening on the inside that's affecting the worker. And we've got several exposures out there. So as you're looking at this, most people just think of the simple acute versus chronic. So if you're looking at this and you see the different years denoted for chronic, accelerated, and acute, those are how quickly the silicosis can develop. So if you have a worker in a situation where over 10 years of mild exposure, you know, they come in to work every day, they're working hard, but they're not being protected from any exposure, over that 10-year period, they could develop a chronic case of silicosis. So that's what we typically would see if you were looking at a construction worker that's cutting road base on a daily basis. That may not be at a high enough level that is going to affect them very quickly, but year in and year out of this kind of exposure, that's where you're going to get that chronic case of silicosis. An accelerated case could be someone who's in a closed area working in some silica. In 5 to 10 years, you're going to see in moderate exposure that they have an accelerated case of silicosis. But with the acute side, now that's only 3 to 4 years. That's heavy exposure day in, day out. They have that, that dust right there. They're breathing it in. In some cases, you're swallowing it. So if the lungs are being affected, then you would know the trachea, just everything, the whole digestive tract is also going to be affected as well. So I know it's not a medical class. I am not a doctor. I don't even play one on TV. But I just want to let you know that this is why we are going through what we are with the silica exposure. And I've heard several times, and I do a lot of seminars, but I do hear that people feel that it's something that we didn't need. This is an unnecessary rule. But with the exposures that we saw at 250 micrograms per cubic meters to now 50, you're going to see a big difference in some health and some exposures. So I did explain a little bit about what you would see with your symptoms: shortness of breath, heavy fever, the bluish skin right at the air lobes or the lips is where you'll see it. You'll see a person with a case of more chronic fatigue and maybe even loss of appetite. So if you're walking around and Billy has that cough and you're like, man, Billy, you got to quit smoking, and he tells you, man, I stopped smoking 6 years ago. You might have to take Billy and get him over to your occupational health clinic and see what's going on with him, because it could be something that is more than just the smoker's cough. So that's what you could see. Here we've got, of course, you could tell the answers. I didn't get that moved out, but I know someone's going to write down in the chat box that A is 2, chronic, and then B, as you see, is more 1. So you've got that 3 to 4 weeks to years with heavy exposure, and then accelerated is right there in that middle range. But I truly believe that if you limit your exposure, then you're not going to get to those levels. So let's talk a little bit about the standards. So now we've got a couple of standards. I'm going to talk more about construction first, because it is the giant of the 2 standards, and then we'll go into general industry and maritime. So with construction, this is the setup of how that standard is. Starts with your scope, and then from your scope you got your definitions, and then how you measure exposure, and then how do you actually control exposure, and then the last part of the standard is some things about medical surveillance, and then record keeping and dates. So the standard itself is broken down kind of like how you would see subpart Z in your other standards in 1926, 1910, 1917, or actually was that 1918 in Maritime. So that subpart Z, it's basically that same type of breakdown. The scope in this is very clear that there are exceptions to this rule. So bullet number 1 is telling you right away that one of the exceptions to this rule is if you could prove through your historical data, if you could prove through some industry data that you have very low silica exposure, and that's 25 micrograms less, then you are below that action item, therefore you are exempt. So if you don't have that empirical data, you could get testing, and if you get exempt from having to keep this rule, then that's a perfect situation for you because you don't have to worry about the exposure controls, but then also your workers are protected. So that is a big one. Bullet number 3, I'll draw your attention to. You got, if you're pouring concrete, the reason why that is an exception is it's different than mixing concrete. The pouring side is where the silica is already contained and it's in a wet way. So if you're mixing, then that's a little bit different because now you have that bag or whatever your truckload that's blowing out that silica, then that's a different type of exposure than wet. So you're pouring, drilling small holes, those are things that you will see in your exceptions. So let's talk about your control methods. There are 2 different ways you could use to control your hazards. If you can't eliminate the silica hazard, the silica exposure, that is the quintessential way that you can protect your workers, then you got to go to Plan B. So this is Plan B, good old Plan B, right? So Plan B, you have 2 choices. One is you could follow OSHA's specific rules in what's called your Table 1, and Table 1 is just basically by task. You could tell exactly what you need to do for your controls. And your other option is going to be your, you could do alternative controls. So we'll start first with your Table 1 task. So with your Table 1 task, before you even get to that table, OSHA wants to make sure that you are going to use your equipment as it is engineered, as your O&M, which is your Operations and Maintenance Manual, tells you to use your equipment. You got to teach the workers how to use that and make sure that it is set up that your equipment is fully functional. If it's not fully functional, then this Table 1 task is not going to be complete, therefore will leave you open for a violation. So you have to make sure that your equipment is top-notch and up to shape and cleaned, ready to go. So I gave you a bunch of my Table 1 activities here. It's not in this presentation where I'll go over everything, but that table that you're looking for, if you've forgotten the standard, it is 1926-1153. So your new CFRs, Code of Federal Regulations, 1926 CFR should be coming out soon because August is when Department of Labor updates their, they update basically things that are passed in the Federal Register. They'll put it in the August version of the CFR. So if you haven't bought one recently, I would pick up your 1926 or your 1910 or any of your CFRs right about now because this is going to have all the most updated material. So you're not going to see this in your current CFR, but you will see it on OSHA.gov. So if you go to OSHA.gov, you're going to go to the top right corner, type in that number 1926, 1053, and then you're going to get access to that table so you can see exactly what those tasks are. So I'm going to go back one, and as I'm going back, let's call it back some, because it's not right there. Here we go. So as if any of these tasks that you're seeing in this table you do as a company or you're around as maybe a third party, OSHA says that there are specific control measures for each one of these items, and that's what you're looking for. The number I shouldn't say number, but also part of the Table 1 is what do you do with everyone else that's on your site? And this, again, is construction. And most of the misconception I've heard with the standard comes from people that don't understand that they are provisions made for controlling your entire work site. And you'll see that here with the Table 1 task. They call it engaged employees versus non-engaged employees. So your engaged employees are the people that are actually doing the drilling, the sawing, maybe it's a walk-behind saw, the guy who's behind the one who's holding the equipment. Those are the engaged employees. They need special care to protect them from any kind of respiratory, crystalline, silica exposure. But everyone else that's on the construction site, you're okay if you just do your regular spraying down, some controls, if you have fans in some cases, as long as the fans are blowing away, not to the workers. So whoever's the project manager, you're going to have to really take care and plan your work site accordingly. But the standard, all it says is that you should protect those workers through some other methods. So I'll move on a little bit more with your Table 1 task. Looking through the Table 1 task, not every task needs a respiratory protection. You can have your respirator if you're, some tasks they're like usually if it's enclosed or the type of work is going to get you very, very high exposure limits of your silica, then you're going to need a respirator. And for the most part, you need a assigned protective factor of 10 that's going to protect your workers up to that level. And there's some that you need maybe a higher protective factor, but those are what you would imagine if you're doing a lot of drilling or something that is going to really fracture block concrete, then that's the ones that need the higher assigned protective factor. But for the most part, a 10 is good. So if you're putting a respirator on your worker and it is not a voluntary, and in this cases, with Table 1, they're telling you it's not voluntary, you're going to have to create a respiratory protection program. And in that respiratory protection program, it's your annual medical evaluation. You're also going to have to do your fit testing each year. And if the worker fails that fit testing or fails that medical evaluation, they are not fit to wear that respirator. Therefore, you would have to reassign them, and they cannot work with the crystalline silica. So that is one of the other additional considerations. So if you don't currently have a respiratory plan, then you're really going to have to start looking for one, because that's going to be an important portion of that. All right, I got a question without the answer, so I'm going to make you guys think a little. So as you're reading this, let's see who could come up with one of those Table 1 activities that I showed you a couple of times. I went back to the chart. Looking to see if anyone's typing in any answers, but number 1 is a handheld power saw. Any blade? I saw an answer. Number 5, someone says. Number 2 is a walk-behind saw. Number 3, drivable saws. Number 4 is a crushing machine. And then 5 is all of the above. So I see a couple of 5s there as your answer. That is your answer. I was just waiting to see if there's anything else there, but no, you're right. That is your answer. So it is all the above. And maybe that's why I wanted to share that chart again for you a couple times so you can see that. So it is all the above. Very good. You pass. You're well on your way to bragging rights. Can you click back over to the question? There we go. So now we're on the alternative exposure. So I told you in the beginning that you got 2 options. One option is you're going to do your Table 1 task, and your Table 1 task is going to spell out exactly what you need to do to protect your workers if you're doing this certain type of task. You could choose that way, but let's say you wanted to do something different. You didn't want to go through OSHA's prescribed way through that Table 1 guidance. Your other option is you could do an alternative exposure control method. So now you are going to take it upon yourself as the employer to figure out what your worker's exposure level is, and then once you figure out your worker's exposure level, then you're going to take whatever appropriate measures you need to protect your worker. So that's your other option. So if you're choosing an alternative measures, now you've got two additional options within this to show how do you know what your exposure truly is. So number one is your performance option. So within an 8-hour time period, each person, you're going to end up basically following them around, and you're going to make sure that within that 8-hour time period that you could tell exactly what that air level is as far as exposure to silica. And you categorize that performance option, and you could do that through, let's say you belong to your local chapter of ABC, your American building contractors, or there's a few other contracting entities like that, or mine, I belong to ASSE, which is the Association, American Society of Safety Engineers. So with that, there might be some documentation out there that shows you that, okay, I have this is my performance, this is what I do, this is the task I have, and there's data out there that says the task that I do matches this data, therefore I could use that for my performance option. So I am going to go through as many programs as I can to figure out if my job, and it has to be apples to apples. As long as what you're doing matches the data that you found, OSHA says that's okay. You could use that data. And once you use that data, then you could definitely put that in saying this is my exposure limit for my workers because of this data that I found. And then that's good enough. So you did a performance option, a performance evaluation. But if you want to do the schedule monitoring, then that's a little different. You could either put on a personal monitor on your worker, and you put that personal monitor on that worker, and it's going to basically be at your most, well, actually with the personal monitor, wherever that worker goes, you're going to be sampling the air. You take it back to a lab. The lab analyzes that meter, everything that's been sampled, and now you can see exactly what your worker exposure limit is. So in that way, and I'm keeping this slide up a little because you need to see there's a few different facets here. One is that monitor needs to go at your worker's personal breathing zone. So if you have them, the monitor on the hip, or if they're hanging it off a lanyard, that's too far. You need to bring it up and clip it right by their breathing zone. So that's an 8-hour time period. That's where you need to have that monitor for a good sample. Then I'm going to draw your attention a little bit further down that you can, on bullet 3, telling you could discontinue monitoring if initial employees are below your action level. So once you get that initial monitoring below the action level, which again is, and I know you're trying to think it, is that 50 or is that 25? It's actually 25, your action level. So if it's below that action level, then you could discontinue that monitoring. And then the next one, bullet number 4, you go down and it says, if most recent, and that's the key, most recent employee exposure is at or above the action level, but below your PEL, so basically above 25 but below 50, then you got to repeat in another 6 months. So I focused on that word recent because it's not initial. Initial's different. That's the first time you're doing the monitoring. The second time that you're doing your monitoring, that's your most recent. So, or if you're doing third, fourth, whatever. So whatever that other time other than your initial, if you're in between that 25 to 50, then you're going to have to do another sample within 6 months. Last bullet tells you if your most recent, again, not initial, most recent monitoring reveals exposure above that 50, that PEL, then you've got to repeat it within 3 months. So you've got a few little caveats in there. So just make sure that you get that time period right, because that time period means a lot to you. So that 25 is, again, your action level. 50 is your permissive exposure. If that reading tells you that you are in between 25 and 50 on your most recent, you've got a 6-month window. But if it is above that 50, that PEL, you've got a 3-month window that you've got to get that sample in one more time. So I just want to make sure I point that out. I'm going to leave this one up for you again because it's kind of wordy. I'm not a really big stickler on wordy slides, but I'm not going to read it all for you. However, I'll leave this up for you to check it out. Construction versus general industry, this is a little bit different. So when you're ready to schedule your monitoring, if that's the option you choose, then you're going to have to make sure your employees know. And when you do need to repeat that schedule monitoring, you got to do it within 6 months of the most recent until 2 consecutive measurements taken 7 or days apart or more days apart has to hit below that action item. So again, when you're doing that scheduling, you got popped, if you will, being that you are above that, you're in between that range of your permissive exposure limit, then now you've got to do it again within 6 months, and you need 2 of these samples in order to clear your name. And then you're good. You're good to go back to operations. You know, you can drop your sampling because you've got past that. So that is a reassessment there, and you got to reassess your control methods, reassess your how you're doing your jobs. Maybe something's wrong with your equipment that you purchased. So that is a time to really reassess and find out what's going on. So your reassessment there, process, control equipment, personnel, work practices. Those 4 things are pretty much what you're looking for. If you could take a good look at those, reevaluate, job hazard analysis are a good way of doing that too. That is, and also how you maintain your equipment is a big one. So keep your maintenance records. All right, here's a question. Who's overachieving and already writing the answer, but I'll read it out. If the most recent scheduling monitoring result reveals exposure above your permissive exposure limit, the monitoring must be repeated within what time period? I see an A, and I see a 3. I see another 3. And I see an A, so we are hitting the home run here. So it looks like we are at that 3-month, and that's just because you're way above or at least you're above the 50. So once you get above that 50, then yeah, you got to do something. If OSHA has dropped from 250 micrograms per cubic meter to 50, then they're saying that that is an important number. So at that time, 3 months is applicable. Appendix A in this standard is for those sampling. Anybody that's listening to this webinar that is in a lab, you guys are going to have some different, well, it'll be pretty much a step-by-step guidance of what you need to do in order for you to diagnose, find out, evaluate, however the phrasing is. If it's 25 or 50, so you're going to have to follow OSHA's guidance. The methods now have to be approved through OSHA, NIOSH, and MSHA. MSHA is the Mining Safety Health Administration. They're the mining sector of OSHA. So once they get those things together, because they actually haven't finished up this sampling methodology yet, so you're going to see more of that a little bit later. So now this part is your controls. I always have to make sure we put in some controls. And you guys that are in general industry and maritime, hang in tight because I know you've got a few for you. However, the standard for general industry and maritime is mostly based off of construction, so you're learning stuff that's applicable for you already. So your alternative exposure control methods. If you cannot eliminate a hazard, you must control it because your workers are still exposed to this hazard. So being still exposed to the hazard, you've got your hierarchy of controls. Number one is your engineering control. That is some physical device, a physical method, something that will keep your workers protected by guarding, soundproofing, something like that, something physical. So in this case, we're looking at wet cutting methods, vacuums, ventilation booths. If you're using a fan, your fan cannot be a supplement to any other control, but it has to be leading away from the workers. Administrative controls is your work rule. That's your number 2 way of protecting your workers. Number 1, engineering. So proper maintenance, training, housekeeping, that's all of those administrative controls. Then number 3 is your PPE. That's when you're wearing your respirators, your gloves, your face shields. Those are your final line of defense, your PPE. Most people think of PPE first if you're going to ask them, well, here's silica exposure. You're going to put your workers full of dust and silica. What are you going to do to protect them? Most people will say, let's get a respirator. Let's just put on a mask. And that is actually the very bottom line of control. Number 1 should be some sort of engineering control. Your employees must be notified if they're going to be affected by this assessment. They got to know. So bullet number 1 is telling you affected employees must be notified within 5 working days after completing that exposure assessment. So again, if you chose not to do Table 1, this is your option, and you're going to have to let those workers know this is our results. So it's very important to OSHA to make sure that the workers are completely involved in this process. So they got to know what those results are. It can't be kept from them, and that's where they can make their informed decision. It's their right to know. So you're all familiar with that right to know phrase, and this is basically what it is. Housekeeping. No, I'm not talking about the hotel housekeeping. This is your general housekeeping to make sure your construction site looks spick and span. I do a lot of construction inspections, and housekeeping is one of the things that I always point out whenever I'm there. It's very easy to think that just because you're in a construction site, you just throw stuff everywhere. In this way, for specifically silica exposure, they want to make sure that there are some very clean, and not clean is something in construction that is very subjective, but pretty much you want to make sure that the dust is controlled. So let's say it that way instead of clean, because your mind might start thinking about something else. But if you choose to use a vacuum, your filter should be a micron filter of 0.3. That's what the HEPA is. Once you get to that 0.3 microns, you're dealing with a HEPA filter, and that's good enough for silica dust. That's going to trap those crystalline silica, those crystals. So that's what you're looking for, 0.3. You're going to do all you can to control your dust. Your engineering control that goes with this is a written exposure control plan. So you got to have this written exposure control plan. All those bullets that you see there is a description of what that written exposure control plan should look like. It's similar to what you would see in a job hazard analysis, but you got to figure out the job that you're doing, how much silica is going to be exposed, what you're going to do for housekeeping, how are you going to keep up with your equipment and make sure that's tip-top shape, that you don't have holes in your hoses when you're supposed to be vacuuming up something and the dust is still blowing through holes. So that's all part of your exposure control plan. Has to have an annual review, and it has to be readily available, and you need a competent person, and the competent person is an OSHA definition. Competent means a person who makes regular, frequent job site inspections, but they also have the authority, and I'll put this up so you guys can see it at the same time. This is the actual OSHA definition for a competent person. So they are capable of seeing a hazard, identifying a hazard, and then they have that skill, that technique, that know-how of how to protect the workers from the hazards they just identified. And they have to have, this is the key, they have to have the authority to make prompt corrective actions. So though you may have someone who is a skilled worker, they may have been with you for a long time, if they cannot make prompt corrective actions because they don't have the authority, they cannot be designated as your competent person. So it's very important that your competent person has that authority, or else they are not competent as OSHA's definition. And Sheldon did not call your people incompetent. I didn't do that. Competent person, now. I love that part. All right, competent person, true or false? So we've got a competent person as one who is capable of identifying existing and predictable hazards in the surroundings or working conditions, and who has the authorization to take prompt corrective measures to eliminate them. We've got a true. Dale, you're on it. I see some more T's coming in. Wow, you guys are nailing those questions here. Maybe it's a little too easy. But yes, you are right. That is a true statement. So you definitely need to have a competent person. And in construction, if you don't have a competent person on site, you won't be able to qualify for what's called a focus inspection. So they're important for you. Medical evaluations, you got to do those medical evaluations. And if your worker wears a respirator 30 days or more in a year, they have to have a medical evaluation, and that respirator is due to silica exposure. So not asbestos, because if you have asbestos exposure, that's a different ruling, different seminar. But for silica, if your workers are wearing their respirators 30 days or more, they got to have the medical evaluation. Every 3 years, they tell you exactly what the doctor needs to evaluate, and it has to be no cost to the employees at a reasonable time for them. So as they, and general industry, you guys have something slightly different as far as your time frame. When the evaluation is done and the doctor comes back, he's going to give the worker, the person who's got the evaluation, a report, a full medical report. But the employer is going to get an opinion. So your opinion is going to tell you if this worker is fit to be exposed to crystalline silica, but the worker will be able to see the full diagnostic of what the doctor has said. You got 30 days for that examination, that report to be given to the worker. HAZCOM, you got your HAZCOM rules. Your HAZCOM rules is very similar to what you're seeing here. So you got to address all those different things. So everyone's got to be trained on all the exposures that's available for them, and if they do have a medical surveillance program. Your record keeping for this is typical like any of the occupational diseases. You're keeping this for 30 years, and you want to hold on to those records, and that's the lifetime of the worker at your facility plus 30 years in that way. Effective dates for construction, June 23rd, 2016, this becomes effective. Employers, you start your compliance next year, and then for sampling, when you have to do the sampling compliance, you got an additional year, June 23rd, 2018. So in that way, you got to start marking your calendar because those dates are coming up. The medical report opinions are due within how many days in construction? A, B, C, or D. A is 15, B is 45 days, C is 60 days, and D is 30 days. I've got some conflicting information here. I got 60 days first, and we got a 30-day in there. So that means you're done with your evaluation, and now you got to get your information back to you. We are doing this in D, 30 days. Those people that are waiting, pins and needles, to find out what the doctor said, they've got 30 days to get that information. So general industry and maritime, as you can tell, we're only 15 minutes left, but however, that's only because you guys have mostly the same things as construction, so I wouldn't have to reiterate that. So you'll see me skip through some slides only because you've just heard me say these things. What it doesn't apply for, this is your scope for general industry and maritime. If you do any construction work, construction is if you're building something for the first time. If you're renovating something, that is construction. If you're painting, that is construction. General industry, if you're doing anything on a routine and a regular basis, now you are doing some maintenance work, therefore you are in general industry. So that's really the textbook definition of the two. Agriculture's got its own section, so it's not in there. Exposure that results from processing of sorbate clay, you are exempt from this rule because that is being bound, that clay is binding the respirable silica. Your exposure is shown not to be 25 as your PEL, then you are exempt. If you are doing anything that is in the Table 1 task, you're flipping over to construction. So you are not in the general industry side. Though your facility may be a general industry or maritime facility, your activity is a Table 1 activity for construction, so you would follow that guidance. So that's, those are some of the things to be aware of. You've got the same PEL in construction and general industry. You have the same exposure limit and action item, so those are all the same in that way. You have the option in general industry to do the performance option like construction. If you could find any medical journals, and you can sign up for whatever you can. There might be some groups like LinkedIn or some other groups that you could be involved in, so you could find out through their newsletters exactly what other people are doing. If you're doing the same thing, then that is going to be reflective of your exposure limit, so OSHA says it's okay, use that data. So you don't have to pay for all that monitoring. Go ahead and use that. But if you do need to schedule some monitoring, then you're going to have to monitor the breathing zones. General industry is a little bit different because you also could have a site monitoring too, because you definitely have a building, so you could just pick the highest exposure, throw up your sampling equipment, and just sample that area wherever that higher exposure is. Just continue your monitoring. If initial employee that exposure is below your action level, and then again your most recent exposure, if it is above the action item but below that 50, so if you're hovering between that 25 and 50 range, you got 6 months, and again, if you're above that PEL, you only got 3 months before you need to resample. So similar things that you're looking for in construction that you see. Here's the big difference for you guys in general industry and maritime. You got 15 working days that those people who need to do the exposure exams, they basically have 15 days that you're going to have to get them that results in writing. And so that's where you have construction's 5 working days. So here you've got 15 working days, and that's, you know, your initial assessment. If you are doing the observation, you have to be protected yourself. You got to wear your PPE, so that's included. If you are in a location where there's a strict area that you hold your silica, then you must have some signage to protect everyone. That is administrative controls. Your signage should say danger, respiratory crystalline silica, and I added a little one too many E's in there, so excuse my adding an extra E. So that is your respirable crystalline silica there. That's your danger sign. Make sure you spell it right or get your money back from whoever's doing your sign. It may cause cancer, causes damage to the lungs. You wear a respirator, and that's pretty much what you're letting everybody know. So that is your duty. You have to have that. You need to, if you're doing your methods of compliance, it's HEPA filters, your administrative controls, PPE, and it's the same there. I am going to skip the question in the interest of time, but it is false. That is a 0.3 is what you're looking for your HEPA filters. Your work exposure control plan is very similar to what you see in the construction standard. You're just going to have to do an annual inspection. Just keep a good eye. Make sure all your engineering controls are there first, and then your other two controls. If you are doing sandblasting itself has its own wording in the standard. So you'll see it in 1910-94, 1915 in Maritime 34. So you're going to definitely have to have your PPE with the guys who are doing the sandblasting because of that exposure is really high. So that is a must for that type of work. Medical evaluations, if your worker, again, 30 days or more are wearing a respirator because of silica exposure, they're going to have that evaluation every 3 years, no cost to them, and you have to make sure it's at a reasonable time. They are getting their report, and you're getting the opinion within 30 days of that examination, so that report is going to be very detailed, and you got to, same thing, right-to-know rules, right-to-know training, got to keep up on that. That's usually an annual as well. Same thing with your record keeping, the lifetime of the worker at your facility plus 30 years. You're holding on to those records, keeping up with them. Well, the dates here are pretty small, so I'm going to read them out for you. It started June 23rd. Then you're going to have a compliance for June 23rd, 2018. So general industry, maritime, you guys got 2 years where your construction counterpart only has 1 year to start getting your compliance methods in order. Your engineering controls, you got to get that 2018. So you got to make sure that at that time period you got 2 years to get your act together, if you will. However, June 23rd, 2020, exposures at or above your action levels for 30 or more days per year, you've got even more time to get in compliance. So OSHA is conceding that general industry may have a few more things that you need to do than construction, so your time frame is stretched out a little for you. So you've got a few more years before you need total compliance. So at that time, I am going to open it up for some questions and answers. I did see that we had a couple in there early. Allison's going to read your questions for me so I don't mess it up too bad, and then I'll see what I can do to answer.
Great. Okay, so just as a reminder, if you can put your questions into the bottom of the Q&A, and I see some in the chat, and we'll try and address just as many as we can. Mark Blake had a couple of questions that I wanted to address that were sent in during the presentation. He said, we are being told by OSHA that we can't use another company's data due to construction materials being different and conditions being different. Do you have any insight on this?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You can't, because you got to make sure it's apples to apples when you're dealing with your conditions. So that, again, would be your performance option. So if you could go to Table 1, whatever activity you're doing, Mark, and you could use your Table 1 activity, that would probably be a little bit easier for you. But you might have to dig. I would call some of your competitors. This is something you're all on common ground. So if they have data that they may have paid for, what's to say that they won't share it with you? So, but OSHA that is right. It has to be apples to apples comparison, exactly the same criteria that they use for coming up with whatever that exposure limit is. You have to replicate that condition at your facility.
Yes, and regarding Table 1, we will be sending out a follow-up email within 24 hours or so, and that email will include Table 1 for your reference. Another question? Let's see. Crystal asked, what is actually effective then for the June 2016 deadline?
that's actually not a deadline, as it is more of when the rule becomes in effect. So it's already here, and so this is a current rule. Now you're just in that transition time before you need to comply. So you're not going to get fined right now. If you're in construction next year, fines could start. General industry, you got 2018 before the fines start. But right now, it's just a date showing when this rule is started.
Okay, and Russell asked, does the standard require executive level participation in compliance activities?
Standard does not require that. However, best practices should, and safety culture, if you're really trying to work with your safety culture will be dead unless you have executive buy-in and backing. So the standard doesn't say it, but you're not going to be successful without it, unfortunately.
And we have a quite robust question. So would you run through a scenario of a construction, demolition of concrete structures, and crushing of concrete with specialized equipment? What new requirements apply? How would we monitor this? What precautions should we take?
This one I would definitely use your Table 1 activity. That is a Table 1 activity when you start with your crushing. So what you're going to use is when you're flipping through that table, it'll show you exactly, and usually it's wet method cutting, but now I think the vein for this question, because when you're doing demo, you've got a whole area that's going to be affected. So if I'm truly seeing the intent of the question would be more of how you control the work area surrounding the demo. If you can't do more of the Table 1 heavy equipment wet cutting, then you're going to have to either limit your exposure. So you might have to start moving your workers somewhere else. So if you have two ways of doing any accidents, two things. You have to have your hazard and you have to have exposure. So if you can't reduce that hazard by wet methods, in this case demolition, that's probably your best bet. Then the next thing is you're going to have to remove the exposure. So just make it as a controlled environment as you can, so you have very limited people there. And if that level is high enough, they may actually need protection as well, respiratory protection. But that Table 1 task is in there for you, and for the most part, it's going to tell you to use a wet cutting method, and you should be good. Or, well, it's not going to be cutting as much as demo, so a bulldozing type thing. So that's pretty much what you're looking for.
So, and how would you monitor those levels?
You're monitoring of that levels, and if you're demoing, you're not going to want to put any sampling equipment right there, and it's actually going to be too late at that point. So that's why for you, in that situation for demoing, anything you're getting back is going to be after the fact. So you're not going to really be able to monitor it because it'll be after the fact. So in that way, what you're going to have to do is control your exposure. That's your best bet. If you can't do any of that wetting, that's, again, controlling the hazard, then you control your exposure.
Good segue into the next question. Can wet cutting reduce levels to compliance in a confined space?
Well, that's a tricky question, because when you get a confined space, you have so many other hazards in the confined space, and so if you're now using a wet method in a confined space, is that going to create an additional hazard? So I would say, depending on the space and not really able to see it, you're probably going to want to use a respirator anyway, because if you're cutting and it's creating fumes, it's creating dust, being on full air, without seeing the confined space, obviously, but being on full air might be even more prudent in a confined space than actually wet cutting. So there's, underground spaces, there's silos, there's so many different types of confined spaces, oil and gas, you've got all kinds of confined spaces there, you got tankers, so I really don't know, but in most confined spaces, I see it looks like tunnels. So if you're tunnels, you're probably going to be looking at a linear issue, so it's not going to be a hose situation. So I would go with a self-contained breathing apparatus, and in that case, you're going to be protected from the silica cut anyway.
And I think we have time for just one or two more questions. So what about sweeping and dumping of a HEPA vac on site? Are they on the Table 1 list?
No, but actually that is part of the activities that you need, because when you're sweeping up, when you're dumping, when you're doing any of that stuff, that's maintaining your equipment. So if you're maintaining your equipment, then part of the Table 1 activity is to make sure that equipment is maintained. You're going to have to do your own control when it's time to dump those filters. So that means you might have a respirator, you might have to have, you're dumping in a situation where you're sucking out the air in a vacuum type setting. But however you do it, it's definitely important to control that exposure for the person who's doing that task. So I'm not sure how you're going to do it without seeing what you have available, but that protection might be more of a personal protection. You might have to, if you can't engineer it out with some vacuum, then, well, vacuum sealed room or something like that. Probably not sealed, but open air might even be better as I'm envisioning this. But it wouldn't hurt to have that person wear PPE at that time period.
Okay, and I think that we have just one more question that we're going to address. When an employee coming from another organization, how would you get the previous record of PEL?
All right, so you got a new employee just getting started, and you want to know if they are, if they get any kind of silicosis, is it yours? So OSHA's typical answer to that, and I'm kind of reading through the question. I know you didn't exactly say that because there's other rules that goes in place. The other rules would be your HIPAA rules. So if you start trying to get other people's records, then you're going to cross over your HIPAA. So that's a different conversation. But for you, if you do still have silica exposure and the worker gets silicosis, then at the point of their diagnosis, then it goes on your OSHA 300 log if you have those that same exposure, unless you could prove that that worker and prove in writing that that worker has been wearing their protection and you did not have that exposure limit. So therefore, it would be then it would go to that other employer as being the person that exposed that worker, but you're still, there's no provision for that worker to go back under their you know, their insurance, their EMOD rate, or any of that. So unfortunately, if I'm reading into this question correctly, it's probably saying the true answer would be yes, it would be something you would have to write into your 300 log regardless of what the exposure limit they had prior to you. Because if you currently have that exposure that could create silicosis, then that would be, you know, your issue to deal with that worker.
Okay, great. So that will conclude our webinar. Thank you to everyone who attended.